Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. One of the most contentious issues in politics these days is immigration. Donald Trump has called for mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, claiming that they increase crime, burden taxpayers, and are even killing and eating people's pets. This year, Republican state legislatures proposed more than 200 laws that can be considered anti-immigrant. And in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams blamed the recent influx of refugees into the city as a reason for cuts in police, libraries, and other public services. Is anti-immigrant sentiment growing? And if so, why? And what impact is it likely to have on the upcoming elections? Here to address these questions is Shirley Leyro, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Borough of Manhattan Community College, and an expert on immigration law enforcement and what she calls CRimmigration. Welcome. You know, I read somewhere recently that 60% of Americans feel that immigrants are good for the country, but you have all of this anti-immigrant rhetoric floating around. Do you think that anti-immigration sentiment in this country is growing?
So the truthful answer is no. We've always had a very anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. I think, however, it feels like it's growing because we have people, very powerful people in the political sphere, once again using immigrants as like the scapegoat for all of society's travails. And also before the Trump administration, the first one, right before, we did see progress in immigration, right? We had true dialogue about immigration reform, right? Path to citizenship. We had DACA, which the Trump administration ended, right? And so people with DACA status still can renew, but no new DACA applications have been accepted since the Trump administration. So during the Obama administration, there was a lot of progress, not as much progress as some immigration activists wanted, but there was progress with immigration. And then you had almost like a reversal. It was pretty much a reversal during the Trump administration. And ever since, you've had this heightened dialogue where people are just being seriously irresponsible, talking about immigrants, the Haitians eating pets, and all of that, you know, disgusting type of dialogue. But we've always had anti-immigrant sentiment, even during the Obama administration, where there was talk of a path to citizenship, where there was DACA. His administration had the most, deportations than any other administration before. So we've always had pretty much, and during that time and since, there's always been legislation, anti-immigrant legislation. Alabama had passed one just a few years ago, HB 56, where they wanted to get rid of all the undocumented people, and it actually hurt the economy. Infamous, right? And it always hurts the economy. But the truthful answer is no. It hasn't been worse than any before, but we just hear it a lot more. And this is a campaign year, for a presidential election, the biggest election that the country has.
And people are using
all the time
as a political tool.
All the time.
I mean, let's go back a little bit to the early history of anti-immigration feeling. I guess it was in the probably the mid 1800s into the early 1900s, where you had the huge wave of immigration into the country, and we were letting pretty much everybody in, unless they were sick or they were criminals, and certain immigrants were more welcome than others, right? I mean, if you're from Western Europe, you're from England or Germany, you were more welcome. But you had other immigrants who were vilified: Irish, Italians, then Eastern Europeans, Jews, and you always had, for a long time, anti-Chinese sentiment.
So every wave, in fact, every wave of immigrants that came into this country, from the early 19th century, early 1800s, mid, even end, they've always confronted anti-immigrant sentiment. And there was always a push against them. And a lot of it was due to nativism. And then when you got to like the mid 1800s, towards the end, beginning of 1900s, there was a lot of economic insecurity that was surrounding the narrative against them. But every wave has really had, sentiment against them. The difference is that, for example, and the Supreme Court has also supported this notion that I'm going to say, that assimilation to being an American was quite easy for those Europeans, the Western Europeans, and then later on the Eastern Europeans. But you had really heightened anti-Asian sentiment with the 1882 Chinese Exclusionary Act. It was supposed to last 10 years. They extended it. We had a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment for the waves of immigrants, and long-lasting ones, for those waves of immigrants who phenotypically were obviously not born in this country. It's racist, right? From the very beginning, the 1790 Nationality Act didn't allow anyone to be a citizen unless there were, free white men, propertied men. Women were excluded. And then the exclusions for citizenship from that Nationality Act, right? There were some other immigration laws that kind of allowed more people in, as you mentioned. But with respect to like the Asians in particular, the restrictions against Asians lasted through the 1950s.
What was the problem with Asians?
So complicated, right? Depending on the years that we're talking about. But for example, with the Chinese Exclusionary Act, there was a huge anti-China sentiment, which kind of still exists, right? We had them on the West Coast helping with the railroads, but once the railroads were finished, now they posed a threat to jobs, right? There was this idea that now there are no other jobs, and now they're gonna, they pose a threat, so now we have to restrict them. Against the Japanese, it was the, World War II anti-Japanese sentiment, right? Women who were Chinese, right, for a time were excluded because they were seen as being undesirable women coming into the country. So, in terms of the waves of immigration groups, all of them have really confronted some, restrictions and some anti-immigrant sentiment, but certainly more so from those countries where they're obviously never going to be able to assimilate phenotypically, right? And that includes, from Black and brown countries, which we started to see a height in them beginning with the Hart-Celler Act, where they opened immigration more to Black and brown countries.
Right.
And that's when you really started to see the ramping up of language about criminality, et cetera.
So it was, first of all, it was hard for immigrants to get in, and once they were here, they were subjected to various kinds of discrimination. For instance,
so jobs, right? We know that the historic one here in New York was like Irish need not apply, right? The Irish, even during the Civil War, there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiment. It's actually one of the reasons why, criminal justice, it's actually one of the reasons why we have such a long legacy of Irish in civil service jobs like the police and fire department, because nobody else wanted those jobs when they were first created. And mainly, restrictions on job, where you can live, who you can marry. We had high anti-miscegenation laws against the Chinese and other groups, where they can live. Pretty much discriminatory across the board.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me to look at which kinds of national cuisines have been popular in at different times. I know at one point in New York, there were German restaurants. That was very popular because Germans were considered the upper level type immigrants, whereas nobody wanted any, Chinese food, nobody wanted any Italian food, and now there's hardly a German restaurant in New York, and the most popular cuisines are Asian foods or Italian food, depending on, how favored that particular immigrant group was.
Well, what's interesting with the German cuisine is that during the First World War, when there was increased anti-German sentiment because of the First World War, right, they changed the name to the hamburger to Liberty sandwiches.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
Little known fact.
When did they change it back?
Maybe after the second.
Okay.
I'm not sure when they changed it back.
Why do you think Donald Trump and members of the Republican Party keep hammering on the immigrant thing? What does it do for them?
Well, it's very effective. right? For a long time, we have used the immigrant population as the scapegoats. And there are easy scapegoats, right? Because they prey, these politicians and other policymakers and other anti-immigrant groups, they prey on the fears of the populace. And some of these fears are imaginary,
And
right?
let's talk about those.
Yeah, so like economic fear, they're taking our jobs, right? And that is not true. In fact, and you can, this is statistical information that you can find anywhere. These aren't my stats. And even the New York City Comptroller's Office has these numbers. Immigration and immigrants, they actually boost the economy. They boost the economy locally in the neighborhoods that they immigrate to. They are also, immigrants also comprise a larger percentage of entrepreneurs than the native born. In terms of the workforce, they pretty much take up the jobs that, in terms of like the undocumented population, they take jobs that native born frankly won't take. In terms
But jobs that need to be done.
that they used to be called unskilled labor, and now we call them, since the pandemic, essential workers, right?
Okay.
Because the work that they do is essential, right? You have from janitorial to food delivery services to agriculture, healthcare services. So we have a dearth of, in the labor force, nationally and locally here in New York State, we have a dearth of home health care workers, people who are in charge of helping the elderly and maybe those who need aid. And it's the immigrants that, you know, comprise the larger percentage of these jobs.
Right.
So they don't take our jobs. The other very common and very effective weapon is they're killing and raping and bringing drugs, right?
And that's not true.
That is also not true. In fact, the immigrant population has lower numbers of criminality than the native born, and that is consistent. And even when we talk about, you know, immigration enforcement, when we are deporting, when we're arresting people and deporting them, the number of people we arrest and deport for non-criminal violations is always higher than those who get arrested and deported for criminal violations. And that's consistent. That has always been the same. So, you know, but it is very popular, right? Especially a large campaign year, like the presidential campaign, the politicians, they bank on, and you just have to see now, especially we're only 30-something days away from the election, you'll see more and more ads on how crime has never been higher before. And so crime is one of the fears that these politicians really bank on for the votes. And then they have the anti-immigrant sentiment. And so they combine it, right?
And it's not true that crime is higher than it's ever
No,
been
it's not
before.
consistently.
It's been going down.
It's been going down consistently since the 90s. And you might see a spike on one or two forms of crime. And there are a variety of reasons for that, right? We know we have less money going into mental health care. We have less money going into social services. You mentioned the Adams administration cutting a lot of the budget. Actually, the budget that they didn't cut and actually increase was the police budget. We also see on the news that overtime, which was about $5 million, rose to like $150 million a year for cops overtime. So the money for certain services has actually gone up, but essential services has gone down. And so when we think about the spike in any type of crime, we need to look a little deeper and see what services or what offerings were also cut at the same time that might have contributed to that rise in just a form of crime, not crime in general.
Isn't it also partly a fear that, quote, minorities are going to take over?
Yeah, so that is a long-standing narrative as well. So Hank Blaylock came up with this minority threat perspective. Hugo Chavez wrote a book called The Latino Threat. And it's about whenever you have a group that has historically been marginalized with little power, and they start to increase power with more political power, more social power, more economic power. Whenever you have a group that starts to increase, you know, those aspects of power, they become a threat to the majority. And that's when you start to see heightened forms of enforcement, higher rhetoric against them, because they now have more and more power. You could say, one very simple one is the 2022 election, you saw a heightened number of young people voting, right? And that was seen as kind of being responsible for the lack of a red wave that was expected and didn't happen. And then right after that election, you started to hear people saying, we need to increase the voting age. right? And so that's not a coincidence, right?
Yeah.
The fact that the Latino vote becomes more and more powerful, the fact that you have a lot more people from historically marginalized communities engaging in political discourse, now you start to see threats. The majority sees that as a threat, and you start to see heightened enforcement against those particular groups.
It is true, like in the last couple of years, this huge number asylum seekers who were massed at the southern border has put a real burden on a lot of cities, correct?
It's hard to say. And the reason why I say that is, for instance, in New York City, the Adams administration is going to ruin the city's going to be destroyed. But in fact, we do have an unprecedented number of folks, migrants, seeking help from shelters, right? So we do have an unprecedented number of asylum seekers dependent on the shelter system. But when we think about the immigrant population influx into the city, the numbers are not different. And so when I see the shelter system being maybe overwhelmed, the shelter system has never been adequate, and it's always been underfunded. When I go to where the Port Authority is and I see, a bunch of people who probably were never there before this migrant crisis, and I say migrant crisis in air quotes, I also see that the streets aren't maintained as much because there are cuts in sanitation, because there are cuts in homeless services, because there are cuts in mental health services. So I am not ready to say that it is the migrant crisis that's the cause of all the travails in New York City, when we know that there's money going to some services, never enough money to other services, and then they have been overwhelmed. But could we accommodate the services that might help the situation that the city and the new migrants find themselves in? I think there's an argument that could be alleviated if the money was resourced historically the way it should have been, and certainly now.
Right. There are so many jobs that are unfilled. There's so many people who are looking for workers. If you could put these immigrants to work,
yes,
it would be good for them and for the city and for their employers.
100%. The statistic, I believe, is the labor shortage is 9.5 million jobs, but we have an unemployment number of 6.5. Right? So there are more jobs available than there are people who don't have jobs. And the same is in New York State. I've mentioned how home health care workers, we have a lack of those in the labor force, and those are the jobs that historically get filled by our immigrants. So it is true, and the Adams administration did express this frustration that with asylum seekers, they can't seek jobs right away. They have to wait at least 6 months. We know that immigrants actually boost the workforce, are an economic net plus for society. So maybe if there was a change in that legislation, that certainly would help. And there's a difference between, for example, the Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, who are being vilified in the most disgusting way. Every politician in that city will tell you that they're doing jobs that they're actually boosting the economy.
Yeah.
Right? So it is true that we can probably do a better job in employing these folks. At the same time, we could also do a better job in just providing the money necessary for the services that they and other New Yorkers are dependent on.
Yeah. CRimmigration.
Yes.
What is it? Tell me about it.
So this was a term that was coined by Juliet Stumpf in an article back in 2006. And she used it to describe the intersection between immigration, which is a civil law matter, and criminal law, right? Immigration and criminal law, CRimmigration, because what we started to do as of the 1990s is we started to pass legislation that increasingly criminalized a lot of immigrants and made it easier to deport immigrants. There were a bunch of legislation, the IRA Act. You had a bunch in the 1990s passed by the Clinton administration where it made it easier to deport people for minor infractions. And so what you started to see—
You mean who had committed just minor crimes?
And we're talking about running a stop sign, right? We're talking about probably, public drunkenness, which, any parade in any city, you see it all the time and nobody does anything about it.
Yeah.
Very minor infractions. In fact, it's hard to even call them crimes, infractions, and they're getting deported for these things. And so what started to happen was that the immigration system became a lot more punitive and started to work closely together with the criminal justice system. And so you had detention centers that started to explode in population, and they looked like jails, and they were run by people who were dressed like the people who run jails. They're not jails, they're called detention centers, but they look just like jails, right? And so the way we started to treat immigrants started to become less civil and more criminal law minded.
Yeah.
And that's the intersection.
You have talked about the impact of deportations. Tell me about that.
So what happens is any person who is not a citizen, including people who have green cards, who green card holders are called lawful or legal permanent residents, but anyone who is not a citizen can be deported, anyone. And so what happens is that liminal status, right, that you have this imminent deportability status, it kind of impacts your everyday life. And when I started to conduct this research, it was about the fear of being deported. And I expected during my research people to tell me, well, you know, I don't commit crimes. I make sure that I avoid the police. Maybe I avoid any situation that might make me, you know, come into contact with police. But and I did get that. But I also started to hear words like depression, anxiety, suicide. I started to hear words that were very symptomatic of trauma. And what everyone universally told me is that they always thought about deportation. And the way it impacted their lives was a very traumatic psychological way. And so what we have is an entire population of people who, both undocumented and documented, who feel they're not wanted, they don't belong. I mean, you know, I had people who had been living here in this country for decades. Their children were born here, going to college, and they didn't feel like they belonged. They didn't feel this was their country. We had people who were like constantly depressed. We had them talking about that they would always say goodbye to their children every day because they didn't know if they were gonna see them at the end of the day. And so it was just a terrible situation to be in, especially when we say we're a nation of immigrants, especially when we say, you know, my research is conducted in New York, and we're a sanctuary city, supposedly. We are an, you know, immigration-friendly city, and yet you had an entire population of people who have this liminal status that really impacts them.
But if they are green card holders, why can't they just become naturalized?
Well, the process is not very easy, right?
Okay.
It's also costly. So, you know, you kind of like LPR, green card holders, is kind of like this interim step before you become a citizen. Yeah. But that process is lengthy, and depending on the year and depending on the sentiment. Remember, you know, some of these people who work for immigration services, depending on how they feel, they might make it harder for a person who's processing the paperwork. It's not as easy as one might think.
People are always talking about the need for immigration reform, and you've got about a minute and a half to tell me what kinds of immigration reforms you would most like to see.
So clearly, any person who's interested in immigration would say path to citizenship, right? But for me, I think that before we can talk about reform, we also have to address the reasons why people are coming to this country, either with permission or without. Much of it is not just the political instability, but climate change. You know, a lot of people are being displaced. So I think within the conversation of reform, we also have to address the reasons why people are being forced to leave their country and seeking asylum, temporary status, or just, you know, safety in other countries. And we're not by far the country that receives most of these people who are being displaced for political instability or climate change.
We're not.
We're not, no. 70% of the people being displaced by any one of these reasons are in other countries. We receive actually a very small portion of those folks who are being displaced.
You know, whenever I try to read, get an update on what the immigration laws are, you know, it's mind-boggling, mm-hmm. you know, because the laws are so complicated and they are constantly changing, and one law is partly dismantling another law, and it's hard to know mm-hmm. where the laws stand. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly true, I think it's clear, that we need to have some kind of meaningful mm-hmm. reform. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that some politicians don't really want real reform because they can continue to use it as a cudgel against
100%.
Their opponents.
I agree with that.
But thank you very much
Thank you for having me.
Helping us understand this issue a little bit better.
Thanks so much.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank Shirley Leyro, Professor of Criminal Justice at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. And you can now watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.